Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. Death, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the entire human race. Our lifetime mission, to go through life trying to ignore the inevitable, to seek out new ideas and try to come to terms with the inevitable, to not so boldly go where every single one of us is destined to go. And welcome to the show. My name is Chris James. I'm your host. Today is June 17th, 2017. This is season number 2, episode 24. Death, the final frontier. We're all going there eventually, but some people have different ways of looking at it. Personally, I hate funerals. I've already been to my required numbers, so no more. I've done honor guard, and I've been in the front row. I helped move the deceased, and I've carried coffins. I've even had to move some dead people from the brush into the back of the waiting vehicle that was going to take them to the medical examiner's office. There are some folks who regard death and dying in an entirely different manner. Let's take a look at some of the funerals that you may never get to attend. The Aztecs believed in the afterlife. They believed that how you died would affect how you would relive. Those sacrificed to keep the world in balance would be given the best places by their deities. So folks would willingly step up and allow the priest to cut their heart out, knowing they were en route to a much better place. Back then, the average life expectancy was only about 30 or 40 years. Life was hard. There was no air conditioning and no deodorant. Toilet paper was a long time down the road. The only people enjoying themselves were the ones saying the afterlife was better. This just might explain why people were in such a hurry to see what was on the other side. Once you were no longer breathing, your body was tossed into the ground and covered with dirt. If you were, say, a warrior of great acclaim, you'd get a bunch of trinkets thrown in with you, but most folks were just deposited and left, without even a grave marker showing where they were interred. In ancient Egypt, the more money you had, the better treatment you got, both while you were alive and after you died. Most pharaohs were treated better after they were dead than the average citizen who was still alive. It was considered wrong to damage the body of a pharaoh, no matter what. Because they were the living embodiment of God, but in order to mummify a body, all those squishy bits had to be extracted. The organs would be removed and placed in clay jars to be preserved for the afterlife. How do you go about removing the stomach and the lungs and the liver without cutting into the body of a god? The high priests doing the mummification had come up with a sneaky solution. The youngest, and therefore the lowest priest, would be charged with doing the dastardly deed. Everyone would be standing around the body, getting ready to work. The fall guy would slip in and thrust a knife into the corpse, try to make a big enough incision, while all the upper-level priests would scream at him and pelt him with stones. The young priest would then run from the room and probably out of town. He would later be forgiven and allowed to return. Since the damage was already done, the high priests would get busy pulling things out and cleaning up the mess. Next, the body was packed in natron, not neutron. Neutron is a radioactive substance. It was packed on natron, a kind of salt, to draw out all of the moisture. The heart was left in the chest because Egyptians believed it was the center of the body's spirit. The brain, on the other hand, was extracted by shoving a steel rod in through the nose and wiggling it around and pulling all the gray matter back out. The brain was discarded because it wasn't considered an essential organ. Now, this is kind of true. Just look at some of our folks in Washington. They seem to be doing quite well without the necessity of using a brain. The drying out process would take about 30 to 40 days. The body was then wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen. Each finger and toe was wrapped before the hands and feet were enclosed. Amulets were placed inside the wrappings. These amulets were carved scarabs. What's a scarab, you might ask? I've seen them out on ranches while looking for folks. We call them dung beetles. The Egyptians believed that the dung beetle was the epitome of creation and destruction by taking something that plopped out on the ground and turning it into life. When we were sign cutting, we considered it a bad sign if you looked over your shoulder to find a bunch of dung beetles were following you. Once the body was properly wrapped up and mourned over, it was transported to the Valley of the Kings, where it was placed inside a casket and then secured inside a huge stone vault that was hidden behind a bunch of walls and then buried. The vault was filled with everything and anything the pharaoh might need in the afterlife. Contrary to most Hollywood movies, there were no slaves locked in with the furniture. The pharaoh was about to go before Osiris, the god of the underworld. Osiris would decide whether the pharaoh had been a good king or just some poser. If he had led his armies into battle and vanquished his enemy, built great structures, or at least ordered others to do all the sweating and lifting, he would be allowed to pass on to the next level of existence. If, on the other hand, the pharaoh had been a do-nothing, he would be fed to Amit. An everlasting life was traded for a trip through the creature's digestive tract. Judgment by Osiris wasn't exclusively to the pharaohs. Everyone who died was brought before the 42 divine judges that would send you in one direction or the other. And the pharaohs weren't the only ones who were mummified. Just about everybody got in on the act, even the cats. There were so many Egyptian mummies found by people, they began using them in place of firewood. Steam trains used mummies to heat their boilers. And then there were those whack jobs that would use the body of the dead as a party game. You would unwrap a mummy as a means of entertainment. There were some strange people alive back then. When British explorers came across the first mummies, they assumed the body had been treated with bitumen due to their darkened coloration. The Egyptian word for bitumen is mumaya, so the name mummy is a misnomer. They should have been called Natrones. The whole idea here was the soul was going to need a place to inhabit, so the body had to be preserved as long as possible. If the body was allowed to rot, or say it got burned up in a steam train, the soul would have no place to live. I wonder if the train engines became haunted by all those displaced mummy souls. The act of mummification still goes on today. In some parts of the world, the mummification happens naturally. A company based in Utah, who had been mummifying pets for the last 30 years, has branched out and are now offering people a modern-day version of the Egyptian practice of mummification. It's not cheap. It's around $65,000, and this doesn't cover the cost of a gold-filled room or any of the artifacts the ancients were all buried with. We're going to take a brief pause here, play a couple commercials, and drink some coffee, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. The ancient Hebrew had some very strict rules when it came to the dead. The body was laid out on a stone or a salt slab, and the direct family would wash it and trim the fingernails and the toenails. The body was also treated to a haircut. The body was then wrapped in linen and carried from the city on a wooden bier, kind of like a stretcher. Women of the family would lead the procession out of town, and mourners were sometimes hired to cry and scream to show the world just how sad you can get when you're being paid to be sad. The interment was done as quickly as possible, usually on the same day. There were exceptions made to this, but the norm was before sundown. The caves were a good last resting place, so families would each own a section of the hillside where they could all be placed. If you recall, Jesus was taken from the cross and cleaned and dressed. Then he was placed in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. See, Jesus' family didn't live in Jerusalem, so they didn't have a tomb there. What with the Sabbath coming and it being Passover, they needed to get the body placed as quickly as possible. And the Bible says, In the place where Jesus was killed on the cross, there was a garden. In the garden, there was a new tomb. No person had ever been buried there before. The men put Jesus in that tomb before it was near. Correction, because it was near, and the Jews were prepared to start their Sabbath day. John 19:41 and 42. Today, Jewish burials take place as quickly as possible, following a principle of honoring the dead. If immediate relatives can't arrive in time, or if the Sabbath or other religious holiday is imminent, the burial can be postponed for a day. If these rules are not followed, it is considered to be humiliation of the dead. Someone will stand or sit with the body from time of death until the burial is over. This is called Shemirah. In the past, Shemirah was a form of guard duty to prevent the desecration of the body prior to burial. The purpose of Shemirah was to guard against rodents, as rodents fear the living but not the dead. Today, Shemirah is practiced out of respect for the dead and that they should not be abandoned prior to their arrival in their new home, which is in the ground. This serves as a comfort for the surviving loved ones as well. Most Jewish communities offer the services of a sacred burial society, which will prepare the body for burial. Men take care of the men, and women take care of the women. They wash the body with warm water from head to toe. They will turn the body as necessary to clean it entirely. However, the body is never to be placed face down. The body is dressed in a simple white shawl to make no distinction between rich or poor. When you're dead, you no longer own anything, so this sounds like a practical idea. A simple wooden coffin is used. None of those elaborate gold-handled, shiny oak boxes. If you look online, you might be amazed by some of the coffins you can find. In the long run, a wooden box is really all you need. The immediate family members will all tear their clothing to show their grief. The parents will tear their clothing on the left side, and all other families will tear their clothing on the right side. Not being flippant, but about everything I own is already torn. The rabbi will tear your clothes for you if you haven't already done it. A Jew who is a member of the Cohen family, a descendant of the priestly class, will only attend the funeral and burial of his immediate family. He is forbidden to come near a corpse, if not of his own family. You may see a close friend or relative who is of the Cohen lineage remain outside the funeral parlor or the cemetery because of this law. Sitting Shiva after the burial, it is a customary for the family. This is a formal mourning time. If a traditional family, they'll do this for 7 days. Some folks have whittled this down to just 3 days, and some will only do this for 1. Traditional Jews cover all the mirrors during this time and sit on what are called Shiva benches. However, less observant Jews don't do this. The mirrors in the home of the deceased are all covered. The idea being that in the Jewish faith, it is wrong to worship an image. During mourning, there is a lot of praying going on. If there is a mirror present, you might catch the reflection of somebody, and this would be the same as an image. The Kabbalists give a more spooky reason for covering mirrors in a house of mourning. They say there are all types of evil spirits and demons that will come to visit a family in mourning. When the soul leaves the world, it leaves behind a void, an emptiness, a hole that just might be filled by one of these dark forces. Wherever there's a vacuum, negativity can slide right in. And so, in a house of mourning, the place where the loss is felt the most, there is a magnet for evil spirits. These demons cannot be seen by the naked eye. When looking in a mirror, you might catch a glimpse of their reflection in the background. So some folks will cover the mirrors in a house of mourning to prevent these nasty things from being seen. Cremation is not ever considered. The body has to be placed in the ground but never burned. During World War II, the Nazis knew this. They went out of their way to cremate the dead. The bodies already buried were dug up and burned as well. The grave markers were used as stepping stones to line walkways. You see, the Nazis wanted to erase all evidence the Jews were ever here. Kind of like a certain bunch of fanatics in the Middle East today. Maybe they should take a closer look at who won World War II. Hindus, on the other hand, are big into cremation. If a person dies in India or other Hindu community, the body is prepared for its final journey. Immediately after death, the body is bathed and dressed. Flowers are placed all over the body, as well as the bier used for transport. The mouth is filled with rice to give the soul sustenance for the trip. A huge woodpile is put together right on the edge of a river, if there is one around, and the body is placed on top. Only a male member of the family can start the fire. However, on some occasions, when there's no male member around, one of the women are allowed to get things going. Once the body has burned enough, the funeral fire along with the body are shoved into the river so the soul can begin its journey to the next life. If the funeral pyre is not close to a river, the fire is allowed to burn out. The ashes are collected and taken to the nearest river and dropped into the water. No cooking is allowed at home until the final phase of cremation. The saying goes, no fires at home until the cremation fire is out. Any food needed is brought by neighbors, but it is a regulated repast. No meat is eaten, and there can be no onions or garlic. A lamp is placed in the spot where the person died, and water is set close by so the soul will have something to drink. The family will remain semi-isolated from the community for a set number of days, depending on their caste. The caste is the person's status in life, be he a farmer, royalty, or a warrior. And then there are the untouchables. The untouchables are those who have done some great nastiness. It is considered taboo to even have a meal in the same room as one of the untouchables. These folks get to clean up after those sacred cows that you see walking all over India. Getting back to the semi-isolation, the family will reintegrate into the community anywhere from 13 to 40 days. Hindus believe that burning the body, completely destroying it, will help the departed soul get over any lingering attachment it may have developed for the deceased body. Holy men and saints are buried in the lotus position. That's with their legs crossed and their hands on their knees. The holy men are supposed to have reached a level of spirituality where they won't be attached to their bodies, so there is no need to destroy the remains. Children are buried because the soul hasn't lived in the body long enough to develop an attachment. So small children under 3 are buried. The country of Ghana lies between Togo and Ivory Coast in Africa. They have a most unique way of honoring their dead. In Ghana, you can buy what is called a fantasy coffin, but only if you're the head of the house and only if you have enough status. Okay, if you're not really coffins, because a coffin has that distinctive six-sided shape, and a casket is an oblong box which has four sides. The Ghana burial container is shaped like, well, just about anything you can come up with. Anything from an airplane to a giant rooster. The idea being, when the person dies, they move on to their next life. Depending on their position in life, they will use the image of their coffin, that's not really a coffin, in the next life. Say your dad wanted to fly when he was alive. You'd nip on down to the local wood carver and order up a coffin that is shaped like an airplane. It's even painted up with whichever logo he would like. This coffin was only seen on the day of the funeral and only for the brief time it takes to leave the funeral and head to the burial site. It's not the kind of thing you'd have on display in your front yard. The reason that mainly the southern Ghana-based Ga people use such elaborate coffins for their funerals is explained by their religious belief regarding the afterlife. They believe that death is not the end and that life continues in the next world, in the same way it did on earth. Ancestors are also thought to be much more powerful than the living and able to influence their relatives who are still alive. This is why families do anything and everything they can to ensure that a dead person is sympathetic towards them as early as possible. The social status of the deceased depends primarily on the importance, success, and usage of the exclusive coffin during a burial. The use of these fantasy coffins was started in the 50s and used only by kings and high priests. Then by the 60s, the idea began to catch on with others who wanted to get in on the benefits of having a happy ancestor who might just help out in the future. Now, if you have the money, just about anyone can buy and be laid to rest in a giant chicken or a wooden whale. When people from around the world got wind of these spectacular coffins, orders came in from museums. The coffin builders use wawa wood to build the coffins that are actually going to be used. Those being shipped for display purposes are made from either mahogany or some other hard wood so that they'll last. If you look online, just type in fantasy coffins and you'll see all kinds of unusual burial containers. If you'd like to look at some close up, you can go to the National Museum of Funeral History in Houston, Texas, and get up close and personal with some of these fine examples of artistic funeral art. Now we're going to take a break right here and play a couple of commercials. We'll be right back, so don't go away. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanelza Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanelza Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. Yes, there really is a funeral home museum. And say you'd like to pursue a career in mortuary field, the museum is also a school. Back when I worked for the government, we were sent to Houston for a hiring board. There were supposed to be something around 24 recruits, but when we arrived, only 6 showed up. Guess the others didn't want a job. We finished up and still had some time on our hands, so I decided I'd go see a movie, The Blair Witch. That will tell you how long ago this happened. The movie didn't start until 8, and so I had some time on my hands. I wound up at the National Museum of Funeral History, and even though I liked that movie, the museum was far more entertaining. Have you ever seen a triple-wide casket? It was built to accommodate a young couple who had lost their child. They decided life wasn't worth living and wanted to be buried as a group. No one carried a casket in the dimensions of their request, so they ordered one up. Once the casket was theirs, they were going to commit suicide, and then all 3 could be spending eternity together in one little spot. Back then, things had to be built by hand by people who knew how to build things. It took time because folks took pride in their accomplishments. The casket was finally delivered, only to find that the young couple had changed their minds. They no longer were in the mood to die, and so the funeral home got stuck with the oversized casket. The triple-wide casket is on display at the museum if you'd like to have a look. They also have an old iron safety coffin designed to keep your loved ones safe and secure while the resurrectionists were out looking for bodies to steal. The lid was bolted on so the grave robbers would have a hard time getting to their treasure. There's a wide selection of hearses from way back. If you have the money and would like, you can rent one for that special occasion. Nothing is as stylish as showing up for a burial in a 2-horse-drawn funeral wagon. If you would, you can rent the entire museum. The museum frequently hosts memorial services, non-traditional weddings, lunch and learn events, workshops, corporate events, team-building meetings and receptions, birthday parties, especially the over-the-hill parties, lock-ins, overnights, scared straight programs, and Halloween parties. Almost makes me wish I still lived near Houston, except for the traffic and the crime and the noise and the smell, which was actually coming from Pasadena, and the traffic. I know I mentioned traffic already, but if you've never driven in Houston, you don't know traffic. When I moved to Laredo, mine was the only vehicle insurance that went down. Everybody else had to pay more on their premiums. If you'd like to contact them or visit the museum, it is located at 415 Barron Springs Drive, just off of I-45 north of Rankin Road, or you can call them at 281-876-0960. 3063. Their webpage is nmfh.org. And remember, any day above ground is a good one. The Navajo people have a different take on this whole death and dying routine. They believe it is far better to die away from home so the spirit doesn't linger in the house. This makes trips to the hospital a must anytime any member of the family looks as if they might just be at death's door. Then they have a fear of the dead. If not properly interred, a dead relative will come back and seek revenge on the living. Embalming is not allowed. 3 members of the immediate family, clothed in nothing but moccasins and covered from head to foot in ash. The ash is to keep the dead spirit from inhabiting one of the team. Go about cleaning the body. Once the deceased has been properly cleaned, the body is wrapped in a blanket and placed atop a newly acquired horse. The horse is led as far north as they can travel in one day, and then the body is buried. Next, the horse is killed, so the dead will have a ride to use into the afterlife. Should the death take place at home, the house is set on fire with the body and all their possessions still inside. The family usually will move away so the ghost can't find them. In Tibet, Buddhists practice a sacred ritual called Hator, or sky burial. Buddhists believe in a cycle of rebirth, which means that there is no need to preserve the body after death. The soul has moved on to another realm, so the body should be dealt with in other ways. The bodies of the dead are taken to an open grounds, usually on the side of a mountain or a cliff. The mortician, mort meaning death, places the body on the ground, and then, using a huge knife, he hacks the body into, bite-sized pieces. These chunks are left out in the open so vultures can come in and consume them. The vultures then fly up into the sky, carrying the remains into the heavens. The birds have become very aware of this ritual, and they'll fly in and wait right next to the mortician as he works. They know what's coming. Now, some might think this is a barbaric act, but then Buddhists might consider our embalming and digging holes to fill with dead is somewhat of a bizarre act as well. In ancient Peru, the Chinchero Indians were mummifying their dead thousands of years before the Egyptians came up with the idea. Archaeologists found hundreds of mummified bodies in northern Chile. Upon examination, it was found these were the original inhabitants of the Peruvian Empire. As in Egypt, the deceased would be cleaned and prepared for the afterlife. Then things got interesting. The body was disassembled. Arms, legs, head, everything was removed. Even the skin was cut off and dried. Once the body had been dried enough, everything was put back together. The internal cavity was stuffed full of grass, and the skin was sewn back on. Then the entire body was coated with ash. This was known as the black mummy process. Later on, say a few hundred years, the Chincheros began using what was known as the red mummy process. The body wasn't taken apart. Instead, dozens of incisions were made to remove all the squishy bits, and then the body was packed full of sand and grass. Later still, they began coating the mummies with mud, which also helped in the drying and the preservation of the dead. The Amazonian tribe of Yanomami is considered to be one of the most primitive tribes in the world. Their view of death is it's not a natural phenomenon. When someone passes away, their spirit is still around. They cremate the corpse, burning it down to a fine powder. Next, they collect the ashes and mix them into a concoction made of fermented banana. Once this mixture has been properly created, the entire tribe comes together and consumes the banana body mix. Kind of like the banana bread I make, only with less flour and a little more body. This is done so the soul of the departed will live on in the tribe. Banana pudding with a twist. You talk about soul food.
Silent breed is people!
Also in South America, the Chichapoya people were mummifying their dead instead of eating them. About 1,500 years ago, the bodies would be mummified in the fetal position. Then they were placed sitting up inside an 8-foot-tall sarcophagi. These sarcophagi were lined up along the cliffs as if they're there to keep an eye on things. Some scientists and archaeologists speculate the idea was the mummies were about to be reborn from the sarcophagi, only in a different form of reincarnation. Viking burials. Who wouldn't love one? The ship filled with all your treasures, everybody gathered around drinking beer or ale or mead, singing, setting the ship on fire, and sailing it out into the ocean. Well, that's not quite how it went, and it wasn't much fun if you were a thrall. First of all, this was reserved for a chief or the greatest warrior in the clan. Then, the dead was buried for 10 days while his family prepared his funeral. A ship was hauled out of the water and set atop a huge wooden frame. A slave girl, that would be the thrall, was sent around, strung out on intoxicating drink, to entertain all of the village men. The idea being she would have great visions of the afterlife and carry any messages to the chief or king. Once the funeral was ready, the chief was dug up and dressed in his new clothing. He was then placed inside a tent on board the ship. The thrall was stood up in front of what looked like a door frame and then lifted into the air 3 times. Each time she was lifted into the air, she would chant. The first time she would say she saw her father and mother. The second time she saw all of her relatives. And the third time she saw her master in the afterlife. If you saw the movie, The 13th Warrior, you'll have seen this scene depicted when the Vikings first approached that village where they're going to become heroes. They're lifting this girl up in the air and she's doing this little speech. They did get that part right. The ship was then set ablaze and everybody stood around drunk and moody. Once the flames had died down, the entire heap was buried under a mound of dirt. I just realized I missed a part. The thrall was taken on board the ship. She was given a lot more strong drink and she was allowed to sing like any drunk chick you've ever seen at a bar just before closing time. Bad things were getting close. The slave was next taken into the tent, and an old woman from the village would stab her in the chest. She would die laying atop her master, who has already been dead for 10 days. Talk about smelly. Then the ship was set ablaze, and everybody stood around drunk and moody. Once the flames had died down, the entire heap was buried under a mound of dirt. The chief's name was carved into a memorial and placed on top of the mound, and then the entire village would sail away. This doesn't look anything like what I've seen from Hollywood. And sometimes, in place of an actual ship, the Vikings would build a stone facsimile of a ship. If you weren't all that high up in the village, you'd be cremated along with all your worldly possessions. We like to say, you can't take it with you. But the Vikings will say, oh yeah, just watch me. Here in the U.S., we are a mixture of just about every country on the planet. Some folks just won't mix, but that's their problem. Too many people want to turn our country into their country. When it comes to burials, we have it all. Back when things were first getting started, the average family would handle all their own funeral arrangements. Someone would put together a coffin or a casket. The friends and family would come from all around to say their farewells. Flowers were piled up around to kind of help mask the smell of decomposition. It was a good idea to get the funeral over quick. The body would be taken to either the closest field where all the past family had been placed, or a community cemetery if they lived close to a town. We're going to take a real brief pause here, play a couple of commercials, let my voice get back into shape. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. We were just talking about how funerals used to be handled here in the United States back a few hundred years ago. Because of all these families burying people out in their backyards or small community cemeteries, it led to hundreds of small cemeteries popping up all over the country. Most have vanished as cities grew and displaced the dead. This is believed to have caused many spirits to grow active. If, on the other hand, the family had lots of cash, a person who died would be placed in the parlor, where all the friends and relatives could come to say farewell. The parlor was a special room where things like funerals and businesses, and if somebody was trying to romance his girlfriend, all of these things would take place in what was known as the parlor. If you had rich relatives visiting from out of town, this is where you would entertain them. The body was placed on a viewing table, which was set over large containers filled with ice, kind of an ancient form of air conditioning. The family would all dress in proper funeral clothing. If they didn't own it, the local undertaker would rent them the clothing, along with everything else needed to put on a proper funeral. It was expected of you to go by and pay your respects even if you didn't know the person, but you were well known in the community. If the house was above average construction, there would have been a second door built into the parlor. It was known as a false door or a death door. This might be where the expression being at death's door came from. It was considered improper for the dead to be taken out the same door as the living used. This sounds a lot of Victorian nonsense, since only the super rich could afford something like a special door for the dead to use. That's what folks with a lot of money do, come up with crazy ideas. During our Civil War, the families wanted their dead sons to be shipped back home to be buried in the family cemeteries. This led to the advent of embalming. If it was going to take weeks or even months to get the deceased home, well, the smell alone would be intense. During the early part of the Civil War, it was the embalming surgeons that performed the embalming practice. Many of the men were military surgeons. However, there were also a large number of civilian surgeons that took up embalming and became embalming surgeons. So portable embalming companies came into being. When the Union Army would move out to intercept the Southern Army, wagons full of embalmers would follow in their wake. There are no records of embalmers in the South during the Civil War. Most of these folks were actually just doing their duty. Kind of like Mike Rowe says, somebody's got to do it. Like anything that somebody is doing, someone will see it as a means of making big bucks. The families still had the funeral at home, but the necessity of lots of ice was no more. After the 1920s, the funeral home came into being. No longer was the body displayed in the parlor, and the parlor took on a new name, the living room. If you've ever wondered why it was called a living room, especially since we live in every part of your house, well, now you know. As towns grew larger and people stopped burying their loved ones in their backyard, the horse-drawn hearse came to be. Carrying the coffin on people's shoulders wasn't an option, since the distance could be many miles. The idea of a home funeral became less common as funeral homes popped up everywhere. Today, no one holds a funeral at home, at least not in the United States. In southern Mexico, they still hold their funerals at home. My brother-in-law, Frank Reyes, told me about the funeral he attended for his uncle. The body was not embalmed. It was taken to the home inside the casket. This was so all the friends in the family could say their goodbyes. Under the casket, 2 aloe vera branches were formed into a cross. Incense and candles filled the room. If the weather had been too hot, the lid would be closed, but in cool weather they'd keep it open. The longest the body would be at home was 3 days to allow people coming a long distance to get there. Friends and family stay with the deceased all day and all night, praying or simply meditating. When it is time to go, the casket is carried to the church. 6 men handle this task unless it's too far. If they have a ways to go, they switch out whenever is needed. At church, they will hold a mass. After this, as the body leaves the church, it is taken out head first. Then, just outside, they do the 3 falls. The casket is placed on the ground. The head is lifted into the air and then set back down. This is done 3 times. Next, it's on to the cemetery, and once more by foot. The cemetery plot is prepared by digging a 10-foot deep hole. The casket is lowered, and then cement is poured in on top. This is in place of the vault used here in the U.S. On top of the cement, a cross is drawn, just a simple sketch. Then the dirt fills the rest of the opening. Back home, the next day, they begin the novena. A cross is formed from limes and flowers and placed where the casket had set. For the next 9 days, everybody gets together in the evening and they pray the rosary. They also socialize, drinking coffee and remembering the one who is gone. On the 9th day, the cross is gathered up and placed inside a smaller casket. This is taken to the cemetery and buried in the dirt on top of the first casket. The next town over, the things are very different. The friends and family gather around the coffin or casket, and they celebrate life. They enjoy each other's company the entire time the body's in the home. This way, as the soul leaves the body, it will remember everybody as being happy and not feel sad about leaving them. When cars became the standard transportation method, motor hearses were developed. Somebody had the not-so-bright idea of building a hearse bus. It was supposed to carry the deceased as well as all the family members. It was a great long vehicle with seating for about 18 people. Unfortunately, engines of the time were underpowered, and if the vehicle came to any kind of a hill, the family would have to get out and walk to the top of the hill and then get back in. The hearse bus's use was short-lived. It broke right in the middle of a funeral. It broke as in the frame cracked and the bottom literally dropped out. The funeral procession was forced to wait in the streets while other arrangements were quickly made. For those of you out there that love RVs, Airstream built an RV funeral coach back in 1982. It looked just like any motorhome of the time until you noticed there was a great big door set on the left side. That was the casket door. Then there was a set of stairs that came out the back where all the flowers were carried to the gravesite. Passengers would sit in front and exit out through the right side. The RV was painted a light gray, so it still looked like an Airstream motorhome. Seating for 18 people. The kitchen and the bathroom were missing. It was 28 feet long, and if you'd like to purchase your own Airstream funeral coach, they run about $10,000 today. They only built 38 of them, so you might consider getting one before they're all gone. Photography was used back in the old days to remember the deceased. A professional photographer would come to the funeral and take a photo of the dearly departed, sometimes laying on the viewing table and sometimes inside the coffin. This was considered normal, and there are thousands of black and white photos out there today of these people. Now today, things are getting a bit out of hand. I have no idea about some people who take selfies next to the dead person. To me, it just seems wrong. The new photo-crazed generation seems hell-bent on being seen in every possible location, no matter how disturbing it might be to others. I've seen people taking selfies in front of accidents. I wasn't going to include this next bit since it doesn't really fit, but then I thought it is kind of similar, so here it is. Back in 1978, the idea of cryonics came into vogue. The theory is by freezing a dying person, you can keep them in suspended animation for just about however long you wish. These cryonic companies are trying to not so much preserve the dead as keep them from ever dying. Bodies are frozen in an effort to keep the nearly deceased from ever reaching that point of being totally dead. Then, through the miracle of good advertising and gullibility, someday in the future, scientists will have found a cure for whatever ails these nearly dead folks, thaw them out just like a frozen steak, and cure them simply because that's what people do. More than likely, the power will go out, as it does all the time, and these human sickles will thaw out, turning into a puddle of goo that some poor janitor will have to scrape up. The Cryonic Society of California, led by a former TV repairman named Robert Nelson, with no scientific background whatsoever, ran out of money in order to maintain the cryopreservation of existing patients. Nelson was sued for allowing 9 bodies to decompose. Don't confuse cryonics with cryogenics. Cryogenics is using cold as a therapy, as in getting a wart removed by the doctor, while cryonics is frozen people. Instead of spending all your hard-earned cash on living forever in an ice cube, how about just getting out there and living? See the world, have a really good dinner, enjoy your time on Earth, and stop making messes for the janitors to have to clean up. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show and found it interesting and informative. If you'd like to hear more, check out the archives at strangethings.podomatic.com or on YouTube, look for Strange Things with Chris James. We are also now available on iTunes and Podcast Addict as well. Till next Saturday, I will see you all later. Death, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the entire human race. Our lifetime mission, to go through life trying to ignore the inevitable, to seek out new ideas and try to come to terms with the inevitable, to not so boldly go where every single one of us is destined to go.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?